Okay, students, I would like to welcome Greg Autry to our competition today. Greg Autry will be speaking on, will the Outer Space Treaty prevent conflict in space? He is an ASU, Arizona State University, professor and space policy expert. Dr. Autry, you have the floor.
All right, thank you. If anybody has any questions, I hope we'll have a little time at the end. Am I correct? We've got 30 minutes, Nicole?
30 minutes to talk and then 15 minutes for questions as needed. I have them put them in the chat, and if they want to ask out loud at the end, they may do so.
Okay, perfect. Just a moment while I get my PowerPoint launched. Okay, great. As I noted, I'm going to be talking about the OST as it's commonly known, and the issue of whether it will do what its primary objective really was, which was to prevent conflict in space. As noted in the introduction, I teach at Thunderbird School of Global Management at Arizona State University, where I run the world's first management degree program dedicated to establishing space leaders. I also teach at Imperial College London and the Institute for Security Science and Technology there. If you want to know more about my background, you can ask during the question period. I have a question for you, though, to begin with. Can anybody answer in the chat? When did the space age begin? Choose one of these two values, if you would. Was it October 3rd, 1942, or October 4th, 1957?
You guys can put that in the chat.
And actually, for some reason, where's the chat? I see something that says team chat. I don't know if I'm seeing the chat, but
that's the correct one.
Okay. Anybody want to answer?
They're coming in now. We've got one answer, 50-50 chance, guys. Okay, here they come. Can you see them, Dr. Autry?
No, it's weird. I see a button that says team chat, which I don't think is the same as the regular chat.
Okay, the one, it's a meeting group chat, and it should all be in the same place. So far, we have we have 4 Bs.
Okay, most people prefer that date. They're probably familiar with it as the launch date for Sputnik. But let me tell you something else. The first human-built vehicle to leave the atmosphere was October 3rd, 1942 out of Peenemünde, Germany. It was a A4 rocket built by Wernher von Braun, who aspired to eventually send human beings to the moon and farther into the solar system. The rocket was renamed V2, or Vengeance Weapon 2, by Adolf Hitler. But the reason I bring this up is it's important to realize that space has been engaged in conflict since day one. Von Braun, when his rockets began to fall on London and Amsterdam, killing over 10,000 people in World War II, famously commented that his rockets worked perfectly, that they were just landing on the wrong planet. The United States in 1946 took the first photo from outer space. And if anybody wants to argue with Germany's 55-mile limit because they're believers in the international definition of the Kármán line being at 60, the U.S. was far above the Kármán line in the 1940s. The U.S. used captured V2 rockets and by putting a Corporal Wax U.S. missile on top of the bigger German V2, they were able to make two-stage rockets and go over 100 miles, well before Sputnik. So the space age existed, and von Braun was the man who took us there. He made certain choices in his first generation of venture capitalists, as we might say, that weren't very good. And the results of that were huge. And it's important to realize, and one of the reasons I teach management and leadership is the people who manage and lead with the technology you develop are every bit as important as the people who develop the technology, because wonderful ideas can turn into horrors. And we have seen that repeatedly in human history, usually when people who think they know better than everybody else create authoritarian states where they intend to impose their ideology and will upon other human beings. Von Braun later got a better venture capitalist, most notably American President John F. Kennedy in the U.S. government, and began to build rockets that eventually culminated in the Apollo missions to the moon in the late 1960s. He is, to some extent, single-handedly responsible for human beings leaving the atmosphere and establishing where we are today on the precipice of human settlement in the solar system. But again, it was military from day one, and that's an issue we have to face. Now, Sputnik was important, but it wasn't about the fact that it went into space. It was important because it stayed into orbit. So it was a matter of how much velocity could you impart to the object so that it would be moving horizontally at a speed equal to the speed at which it was falling, so that it would never hit the ground or be in orbit. And the way the Russians did that was by using an R-5 intercontinental ballistic missile they had developed based on technology they had exported from Germany after the collapse of the Nazis, copying the V2. So conflict has been a thing. This photo here is of a U.S. operation called Starfish Prime, in the early 1960s, when we were detonating nuclear warheads in the atmosphere, mostly over the Pacific Ocean, launched from Johnston Atoll, a small island in the Hawaiian Islands chain. The Russians were doing the same thing. These are views actually of nuclear explosions in space, taken from Honolulu in the early 1960s. Hotels in Honolulu actually had rooftop atomic bomb viewing parties because the explosions were really pretty, and they would create kind of a electromagnetic storm effect, and you could see kind of a aurora occurring right there in the tropics during this time. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, when the U.S. and Russia were posturing over Russia's military base in Cuba being equipped with medium-range nuclear missiles, the U.S. and Russia that week each detonated 3 warheads in space in order to basically show what they could do. Now, it's important to think about why you would detonate warheads in space. If you can detonate them there, then the assumption is you'd be capable of flinging that warhead anywhere you wanted to. And secondly, they are weapons in themselves, electromagnetic pulse weapons that, while they generate all those pretty colors, can also take out potentially the power grid and electronics of any city that they might be detonated over. This is a concern right now. Right now you have a situation where both Russia and China have hinted that they don't consider nuclear weapon detonations in space to be either a violation of the space treaty or a strategic nuclear attack if the purpose is to generate an EMP. And this is something Russia might do in Ukraine out of desperation to disable the Ukrainians' kind of superior technology at this point, a lot of which they're getting from United States commercial actors. And China might do it versus Taiwan, which is a renegade province in their mind and an independent country in the mind of some others, but a place that they would like to occupy. China has notably just established a military base in Cuba, and a situation very similar to what we saw in the 1960s could unfortunately emerge from that, and space would be a big player. So the Outer Space Treaty was signed in 1968. in order to try to prevent some of this stuff from happening. Most of the countries in the world are signatories to it, and basically every important spacefaring country is. There are a couple of notable countries that didn't sign, and these were either failed states at the time, they were undergoing chaos and revolution, or they, simply weren't engaged in anything that looked like space, and they didn't see it as an issue. But Djibouti, which is kind of on the Horn of Africa, actually isn't a signatory, and the Chinese are building a nominally commercial space launch platform there, which would allow whoever flew out of there to theoretically potentially assert that they were not subject to the OST. Angola on the west coast of Africa is in a similar situation, and you've got one country on the north of South America, right next to the European launch facilities in French Guiana, and that could be a place where you might see space launch, because equatorial is good for space launch. All right. The OST principles were supposed to be inspired by the greater prospect of opening up space for all mankind. We now say humankind, but that's where that language mankind came from that Neil Armstrong repeated when he was on the moon. To recognize the common interest of progress, believing that exploration should be carried out for the benefit of everyone, desiring to contribute to international cooperation, and believing that that cooperation would contribute to the development of mutual understanding and better relationships between the people here on Earth. These are all noble and good aspirations, and the 1960s were kind of a mode of where everything was governmental, and there was kind of what I'd have to call a socialist sort of kumbaya feeling in many countries in the world, and these ideas that things would be done for the benefit of everybody mutually, and that we could all find peace together were very popular. Regrettably, the last 60 years of history don't bear much of this out on Earth, and that's kind of what I want to talk about here. So I'm going to go through the important articles of the treaty real quick. Firstly, Article 1 said that the use of the moon and other celestial bodies shall be carried for the benefit and interest of all countries, irrespective of their degree of scientific development, and the province of all mankind. This is really important because it basically implies that individual commercial actors can't go up there and stake goals and make money for themselves, or that individual countries couldn't stake out chunks of the moon or other celestial bodies for their own interest, that somehow you would have to share or ensure that your activities benefited everybody. Article 2 is really explicit that you can't nationally appropriate a body, celestial body. So when the United States stuck the flag in the moon, they couldn't say, hey, that's ours, the way that colonial powers had back in the 16th century all over the world. This could be a problematic thing that we're going to talk about in the future, but the assumption was that by preventing arguments over who owned what, that we wouldn't have conflict in space. Article 4 outlaws those nuclear weapons in orbit around the Earth. And to be clear, the explosions that were done in the 1960s were suborbital. They just launched a warhead up to fairly high altitudes, 400 or 500 miles, and detonated them. They were not in orbit. So this prevents kind of an orbital nuclear weapons platform, but not necessarily the detonation of these weapons for the EMP attacks that we're concerned about today. Prevents the establishment of bases and installations and fortifications, the testing of any type of weapons or military maneuvers on celestial bodies. So you can't build a military complex, and maybe you can't build a police station on the moon, and that has interesting implications. Article 5 says we're going to help each other if we're in trouble, and not too many people disagree with that. There's a separate treaty on astronaut rescue and recovery signed by most countries. Articles 6, 7, and 8 make it clear that a country's responsible for any actors that are operating on its behalf or flagged by it. So you'll see that every spaceship you see fly and every rocket has a flag on. That's not just because of national enthusiasm, it's because they're required to, just like ships at sea are required to be flagged by somebody. So if Rocket Lab, a New Zealand company who moved to the United States, launches a rocket from New Zealand, it's got that American flag on it, it means the US taxpayer is ultimately responsible. If something goes wrong and that rocket lands in Australia and destroys a factory near Perth, that's an American taxpayer problem. And it's really important to realize that countries are on the hook for the operations of the commercial companies, but they don't necessarily have any mechanisms by which to enforce the behavior of these companies when they're outside the atmosphere. Article 9, parties to the treaty shall pursue studies of space in collaboration and avoid infecting other planets with Earth microbes, basically, and avoid bringing back some plague from Mars to the Earth. Now, personally, I think this is a ridiculous piece of the treaty. Today, we really begin to believe that panspermia, the idea that at least very simple microbes in the building blocks of life have transferred between the planets in the past and will continue to do so in the future is most likely. So saying that we have to really worry about whether we took some microbes from Earth to Mars when in fact asteroids hitting Earth and Mars have been blasting material into space, which has made that transit many, many times, renders that argument somewhat spurious. Article 12, basically all installations and equipment on the moon or other celestial bodies shall be open to visitation by representatives of the other power. So if the United States builds a moon base, apparently we have to let the Chinese come in and check it out. They don't need to send a spy balloon. Now, the reality of this is countries continued to do their military thing. In 1974, the Russians, Soviets installed this cannon, the LMS space cannon, on their Salyut 3 space station and tested it. Nothing preventing them from doing that. This weapons ban is on the moon or weapons of mass destruction or nuclear warheads in orbit. Does not prevent you from putting up a cannon that could easily attack other spacecraft or be used as a defense for your station. Now, of course, you know, space is a big business. The commercial sector is booming. It's somewhere around $500 billion. Most people believe that by 2030, we'll be hitting $1 trillion. By 2040, maybe $3 trillion, which is the size of the UK economy. That's a big number. Space launches are growing rapidly. The US is now the leader thanks to our commercial development. And most importantly, the number of payloads that are launched, and this is only through 2020. There are now about 9,000 satellites in orbit. Just a decade or so ago, there were only about 1,000 active satellites in orbit. Almost all of those 8,000 additional satellites were launched by the United States. A huge number of them are SpaceX Starlink satellites. Commercials so busy that I got to take this remarkable picture. I was on an airplane flight from Miami to North Carolina, and we happened to be passing the Cape, and so I looked out the window because I was hoping to see the Space Launch System, which was on Pad 39B for its wet dress rehearsal. And hey, I happened to catch a commercial space launch out of Pad 39A, which was in fact a friend of mine, Mike Lopez Alegria, on his way to the International Space Station on an Axiom flight. That's just a coincidence. I'm sitting in the right seat on the starboard side during the right 5 minutes, but there's so many launches that when, you know, I'm in Florida these days and I hear a rumble in the middle of the night, and I don't even know which one it is unless I go look it up. I used to know every launch that was going to occur, but now it's twice a week or more. Commercial space development promises a lot for the world. Global communications, locations, removing heavy industry from our precious Earth so that the blue planet can stay blue, emissions-free power from space solar power or helium-3 potentially, better climate tracking, mitigation of space debris that's been put up there by governments, which is really important. All that space crap is governments. It's not Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. It's government. A backup of the biosphere for our life and for human culture. Something really bad can happen to our planet. It's happened many times in the past where we've had mass extinctions wipe out more than 50% of living things. This could happen again. And our culture could easily be destroyed. So going to Mars is a plan, as you probably know, that Elon has advocated is our backup. Revolutionary medical advances will come from having to deal with this very harsh environment, as well as the opportunities that microgravity presents in things like manufacturing artificial organs. Improved resource management and increased agricultural efficiencies come from a lot of the space technologies that are being developed. Now, successful commercial development requires that there be rule of law. Companies need to know what the rules are, and if somebody violates the rules, there need to be some guarantee that those issues will be resolved and somebody who is capable of enforcing them. You've got to have defined property rights. I own this stuff, and I own the real property, the land under my lunar mine, lunar processing plant, lunar refinery or factory, or Mars refinery, factory, or colony. It needs to be exclusive to me. Nobody else can just come along and say, hey, you're not allowed to own anything on another planet. I'm going to squat right here in the middle of your settlement, right? It needs to be transferable. I need to be able to sell this thing to somebody else, or if I should die, pass on to my heirs my interest in whatever it is that I've spent my life developing. And it needs to be collateralizable. This means that you can borrow against it. No industry in the world ever gets very far on just venture capital. Okay, when Apple needs more money, they don't go and find venture capitalists. They can go to bond markets and borrow money, and they do that routinely, even when they're throwing off huge amounts of profits, because it's better to fund their growth out of low interest borrowed money than give up equity or take the money that's coming from their sales and reinvest it in the United States, where they'll have to pay U.S. taxes on it. They can keep that money abroad and avoid paying U.S. taxes. So businesses that want to do well need to have debt financing. And if you're going to build a factory, you don't like go get venture capital to build a factory today. You go and you borrow money against the land under the factory and all the assets of the factory. And so the Outer Space Treaty makes that technically impossible to do, and is a real conflict with a successful commercial development. So right now, as we mentioned, the OST applies to different countries. And for instance, if a US company like Boeing here does some operations, the US government is responsible for it. If a Chinese state-owned enterprise does something, then of course the Chinese government's responsible for it. But if Angola goes off and does something, nobody's responsible. If an independent entity that declares itself free of any earthbound government on the moon, Mars, or wherever does something, the Outer Space Treaty does not know what to do with that. But it still leaves US commercial actors tied to the US government, and the US government responsible for them. In my opinion, this creates a really difficult situation, a Wild West sort of situation. A great historical example of this was back in the mid-19th century. The United States had ended up in conflict with Native Americans across the continent, and most notably, the warlike tribes of the Plains Indians, the Sioux, who were very good fighters, could not be contained. They had a particular interest in an area known as the Black Hills, which was sacred to them in the Dakotas. And the United States signed a treaty that said that for all perpetuity that the Black Hills would belong to the Sioux Nation and people, and that nobody could do any development there, and that if any bad, it actually says bad men in the treaty, should impinge, that the United States government would protect the territorial integrity of this property for the Sioux. But guess what? Gold was discovered there. Commercial actors immediately began to pile into the Black Hills. They ended up fighting with the Sioux. They ended up fighting with each other. They ended up fighting with the U.S. government. When the U.S. government interceded, it ended up in a whole Indian War, which eventually resulted in what we know as Custer's Last Stand, one of the biggest military defeats for the U.S. Against Native Americans in history. A couple thousand soldiers were taken down by the Plains Indians. That wasn't necessary, but it occurred because there was a treaty that really couldn't be enforced. Whenever you put together a treaty and promise something, but you can't deliver it because there's no real enforcement mechanism to protect what you promised, you end up in a situation like we did in the 19th century, where anybody with a gun could make the law. I think this is going to be a real issue when we end up with some people who are eventually going to say, no, I'm really not part of the United States. I'm part of this orbiting O'Neillian space station, or this settlement on Mars, or this lunar colony. And you can take a hike with your U.S. taxes, regulations, and rules. We're going to do what we want here. And other countries are still going to insist to the United States, no, those guys came from you. They're your responsibility. It's going to be messy. The Outer Space Treaty doesn't know what to do when a Chinese state-owned enterprise is running an operation near a nominally US commercial entity, and they end up in conflict physically over some section of, say, an ice mine, or a particular good peak for putting a solar panel on, or their radio transmissions are stepping on each other. There are no UN space forces to go up there and do anything about that. No UN white hats are going to fix this problem. The United States has moved forward unilaterally to try to deal with the problems in the Outer Space Treaty by stating some things about commercial competitiveness, that we view commercial actors as having a right to operate on the moon and other celestial bodies, to extract materials and own them. 2015 law was really important. I like noting who it is that drafted the 2014 law. It's Kevin McCarthy, the current Speaker of the House, which makes me feel better about the budget situation that we may be seeing facing space. I can assure you, Kevin McCarthy is a fan of space, and of commercial space in particular. This act specifically said that the U.S. shall facilitate commercial exploration, discourage government barriers to development, and promote the rights of United States citizens to extract commercial resources, basically. I was pleased to be part of the last administration, the Trump administration space policy team. It issued a number of space policy directives and statements that were super important. The number one was that we were going to extend human economic activity into deep space with a permanent human presence on the moon, and eventually human missions to Mars. It's really important to have gotten over this hump where we're talking about permanent settlement in space and economic development, not just science missions with flags and footprints. The Trump administration also issued an executive order saying Americans have the right to engage in commercial exploration, and importantly, the United States does not view space as a global commons, meaning that it does not belong to everybody. If I create a space settlement, you are not going to go ahead and just say, Mars belongs to everybody, I'm going to squat in the middle of your Mars settlement. NASA has also implemented something that I suggested years ago, which is actually buying an asset from a commercial company that has extracted in space. So they've agreed to buy moon rocks, basically from private companies that are capable of extracting them, not because NASA needs moon rocks. It's not even going to take physical possession. It's going to take title to the moon rock when it's removed from the lunar surface, in order to set an international legal precedent that a commercial company can extract something and sell it. The Artemis Accords, bilateral agreements between the US and other countries, are hopefully going to standardize these sort of norms that will allow commercial development. Two countries just signed a couple of weeks ago. Ecuador, I'm proud to say that I and my students at Thunderbird had a lot to do with getting Ecuador on board, and excited to see India joined as well. The Gateway concept, one of the reasons that it was proposed and supported is because it allows a number of international engagements to occur there, and it's important to get other countries engaged in America's lunar plans so that they also support the norms and behaviors we want to see standardized, including the ability to have economic development and protection for the things that you build on the surface of another planet. of course, one of the modules here was going to be from our friends in Russia, and well, they're no longer anybody's friends, and they've kind of self-destructed, and their space program, I think, is going to be completely dead within the next few years. So what do you do about that? I'm hoping India might step up. That would be exciting to see. There's been an open conflict between the current NASA administrator, President Biden's appointee, former Senator Nelson, and the Chinese. They've been back and forth on that, but Nelson is really clear that he doesn't want to see the Chinese dominating the moon, and he doesn't trust them to not use the same sort of behaviors they have on Earth, where they have continually expanded their borders and claimed the territories of neighboring countries like Taiwan or Vietnam, the Philippines, India. They basically have a territorial conflict with every country on their border. China has fired back by claiming that, for instance, Starlink satellites are threatening their space station, which is interesting because the Starlink satellites that they're complaining about were there before they launched their space station. So they put their space station in the way of the Starlink satellite and then said it was a threat. They've, of course, also been chunking uncontrollable boosters all over the place and dropping them randomly around the world, and SpaceX has complained that their stuff has been near their satellites. So it's a little bit of a mess there. I do think that we need to have some better agreements, but I think they have to recognize rule of law. And lastly, on this point, I want to say competition is really good. Remember, we talked about Sputnik, 1957. That really upset a lot of Americans because they saw we were falling behind an important technological area, and this area could involve throwing nuclear weapons across continents, because that's the sort of rocket technology the Russians had used. So just 13 years later, this Cold War space race had propelled us from a basketball-sized object that could go beep, beep, beep to actually putting human beings on the moon, and technology that still today kind of represents the leading edge of high tech, even though it was half a century ago. That was done in just 13 years, right? Then we all got together in 1974, made good with the Russians, and had an event known as the Handshake in Space, where a Soyuz and Apollo docked to each other, and we agreed to cooperate. We began to do that. So 25 years later, we had a small space station in orbit that looked a lot like the Apollo-Soyuz docking system and was in the exact same 51-degree inclination at about the same altitude as the Soyuz mission. 22 years after that, we have a bigger space station, still has a Soyuz dock to it, is still in the 51-degree inclination. It's still at the same altitude. It's just a kind of scaled up version of what we were doing in 1974. We haven't done anything new, bold, or exciting since we had a handshake in space and agreed to cooperate. So everybody that argued that working together would create more was actually wrong. Competing created more. And I would just say to you, imagine the Olympics. Would you watch the Olympics if the goal of the Olympics was for all of the runners to get together and cross the finish line at the same time in a cooperative manner? No, not interesting. Doesn't motivate anybody to try harder. You need competition. So competition is good. The arguments we have going on with China, these could be really good for both of our countries moving forward, but conflict, bad. And the Outer Space Treaty creates a situation where conflict is, in my mind, inevitable because of this lack of sovereignty. If nobody's in charge of an area of Mars or an area of the moon, and I mean by that, it could be the United States, it could be China, or better yet, it could be the people who actually live there running their own government that is sovereign over the territory that they're actually developing. If nobody's in charge, it's unclear how you protect them from being exploited by the bad men, as we discussed earlier. And non-state actors are now emerging. I've got two things here. One is a super small satellite called a space bee, and another is a pterogrid, or a water bear, a small microscopic multicellular creature. Both of these have recently, in the last few years, been launched without the knowledge of the launch provider, supposedly on this. The space bees were denied a launch permit in the United States by the FCC, and they went and got space on an Indian satellite in our Indian launch system that launched 169 different payloads, and the Indians basically said, we didn't know what they were, right? So when we get to the point where people can launch things without government approval, then the whole basis of the Outer Space Treaty, claiming that a country has to have control over its space actors falls apart. You now have non-state actors. Now, neither of these were super malicious activities. One of them was in violation of FCC safety concerns, and the other one was a violation of Article 9 of the Outer Space Treaty because we did pollute the moon with an organism. But once that happens, there's a problem with the treaty. And if you don't have sovereignty and you don't have a physical force that can do something about it, you've got a problem. So the US created the Space Force to deal with that. I'm excited to see the Biden administration stepped up and called for bans on testing of kinetic anti-satellite weapons. Those were creating a mess in space. We don't need that. UK did the same thing. And I am done and ready to take questions. But if you ever want a degree in space policy, leadership, and business, come see me. Okay.
That was going to be my first question. Can you tell us just a few sentences about your degree in space policy?
Sure. So we teach at the Phoenix facility featured on the left, and this beautiful building in downtown LA. I carefully took this picture with the moon in the upper right-hand corner and my Tesla with its new space license plate, but it's a really great building. It's a one-year master's degree program, the equivalent of essentially an MBA, but all about space. So we teach space marketing, we teach space data, we teach space finance. And for instance, your finance class is taught by Steve Shin, who is the deputy CFO of NASA, of all of NASA. He was the acting CFO when I was President Trump's nominee to be the CFO there. Here's some of our students, for instance, visiting the Blue Origin facility, at Kennedy Space Center, more Kennedy Space Center, more Kennedy Space Center, visiting ULA there. We go and see both the Space Force side of things and the NASA side of things in Florida. We'll also do a week in Washington, D.C. While we're in LA, we'll visit companies like Rocket Lab and SpaceX and connect you with amazing people. In our classroom, we've had Charlie Bolden, President Obama's NASA administrator, Scott Pace, the head of National Space Council under Trump. We had Tori Bruno, the CEO of United Launch Alliance. Amazing group of people. It's designed for busy working professionals, so you don't have to quit your job to do it. All right, so let me close my share.
Okay, questions. So continue putting questions in the chat. Mena would like to know, do you think the energy produced, somebody else is coming in. Do you think the energy produced by nuclear will have a devastating impact in the future? Are you meaning on Earth or in space?
Yeah. I mean, I hope the energy produced by nuclear will have a wonderful impact in the future. It's the only way to address climate change concerns on Earth, because solar panels don't really work at night. They don't work in the winter. They're really bad at high latitudes. Windmills are unreliable, and both solar panels and wind turbine blades fill up our landfills. I know Dr. Subrin agrees with me on these issues. We need nuclear, and we need nuclear in space, because getting to Mars in a timely manner without being exposed to radiation, ironically, really depends on having nuclear propulsion, which is entirely possible, and we've been doing it in testing since the 1960s. So I hope that's good. I do not like the idea of nuclear weapons in space. I think that's a very bad idea, and it's good that the Outer Space Treaty bans them. The question is, though, can you trust actors like Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping to honor their treaties? And the indication is no, you can't. So you may have to deal with that anyway.
And that's a great segue to the next question. And Mena said both, so I think you answered for both of those. Is it possible that we will not have conflict or war once we are settled in space? Can we trust that that will be peaceful?
It's never happened before. And whether you like it or not, you're kind of delusional if you don't realize that either by God or nature, we are created as a competitive entity. The Darwinian system causes species and even individuals to compete with each other over limited resources so that they can pass on their genetics. That's the way of life. It is built into our biology and into our psychology. And every attempt to deny that by creating a socialist sort of governmental system has always resulted in economic failure because, as I noted, it removes that competition that drives people to try harder. And so not only do you not have good things happening in space in countries where everybody gets the same thing, regardless of how hard they work, everybody gets the same crap. So I think that conflict is inevitable because people are going to be pushing to acquire limited resources because that's their nature. Now, the good thing is when we open up the solar system, there's a lot more resources and less need to argue over them. Whereas if we don't open up the solar system and we listen to the people who say, let's solve the problems right here on Earth before we go to Mars or anywhere else, I guarantee you there will be hellacious conflict until we are all dead. It's as if you locked a group of rats up in a cage, and let them let them breed and consume resources and pollute the cage. It's going to be bad. We could do better here, absolutely. And Dr. Zubrin talks often about the fact that there need not be resource limitations, but in the real world, there will be because of this human drive to grab resources. So I think space lends itself to more peace, but now there will never be permanent peace because it is in the nature of biological organisms to compete.
I
And
teach my students something very similar, that when they say we need to solve problems on Earth, I'm like, we're never going to solve all the problems on Earth.
yeah, I give a speech at Oxford on, I don't know if you saw it on populating Mars. If not, I'd love to share the link with you on
Oh,
that.
yes, please do.
And I said that the Earth First is a honey-do list that can never be completed, right? When I
Correct.
die, there will still be a list of things that my wife has planned for me to work on again. And when the Earth is over with, we will still have poverty, and because poverty is relative, right? It used to be that there were literally people starving to death in the United States when there was an agricultural famine or other event. Uh, Now the problem is maybe they don't have the latest generation of cell phones, right? But even the homeless in LA all have cell phones, right? And they have some
Yes.
pretty nice tents. I'm not saying I'd want to live there, but by comparison to 100 years ago, they're living large, uh,
Right.
and nobody should starve as long as your government isn't doing a bad job of managing your economy and your distribution. So, uh, it's just the nature of things. We're always going to have these problems. And
Agree. So we have more questions coming in. Angela wants to know, what types of punishments do countries get for breaking a policy from the space treaty? Great question.
there you go. And what can the UN actually do? So it really turns out the UN has no teeth, which has been a constant problem. The only circumstance where the UN really had teeth was the invasion of South Korea by North Korea in the 1950s, when the United States convinced the UN to form a unified force to oppose the North Korean opposition. Ironically, the Russians, who were on the Security Council and normally would have defended the communist nation, were boycotting for another reason, and they did not vote against it. But otherwise, you've got China and Russia on the council. It's highly unlikely that you're going to see any agreement on big issues like this. And the UN makes a lot of speeches and a lot of statements and occasionally treaties with high-minded principles like this, but they have no way to actually enforce any of it.
Mhm.
So countries under the treaty, though, are expected to do their own enforcement. So theoretically, if American company XYZ did something naughty in space, the American government could try to punish them under US law, which would primarily involve economic fines against them. And as long as that company has a lot of interest here on the ground, then that works. But as soon as that company is mostly on the moon or mostly on Mars and doesn't really care what the US government says, good luck. Who's going to do something about it? The
Right.
reality is nobody. And so the US is going to have a space force which will hopefully have some capabilities to defend commercial actors, US commercial actors, from impingement, and if necessary, make them do the right thing, so we don't end up with that situation we had where American citizens were violating the rights of the Sioux Indians and it turned into a war.
Mena would like to know, if humans went to Mars or any other planet, Who has the right to create the laws for that planet? The lawyers on Earth or the people who landed on Mars will be its permanent citizens.
So when we say rights, do we mean legal rights or do we mean moral and ethical rights? In my mind, the right to self-governance is a sacred human principle from a moral and ethical standpoint. And this comes from leaders of the Scottish Enlightenment and the founding basis for our country. The United Nations, though, and most of the governments on Earth believe that governments on Earth will make all the rules and tell people how that will work. History shows that won't last. Colonies that have been established by other countries eventually begin to resent the behaviors and demands of the home ruled country, and they split off. And we've seen that over and over again since the Roman Empire, and of course with the European colonies in the New World that all eventually revolted against Spain, France, and England, and went their separate ways. So right now, legally, it's the people on Earth, but in reality, I believe that you will see it will be the individuals on the ground making their own rules that apply to them.
Yes, at some point when it gets there. So can you expand? I had a question. When you talked about the global commons
Mhm.
and who was, in charge of that, or what can we do with that? Can you explain a little bit more about that?
Sure. So the wording of the Outer Space Treaty implies that anything you do in space has to be for the benefit of all mankind, not for your own company or your own self. So if I spend billions of dollars to build a rocket and send it to Mars and build a space colony and extract Martian resources in order to do in situ production, theoretically, according to the Outer Space Treaty, I'm doing that for everybody. And this would imply that if a bunch of refugees from country B show up, that you have to kind of let them into your space colony and share the goods, right? Or if you're making money off of what you're doing on Mars or the moon, you're going to have to share that money. And so there are countries that do not have space programs for a variety of reasons, mostly economic, or they simply can't get their act together, who are already voicing demands that companies like SpaceX or Blue Origin are going to have to pay them if they make any money out there in space. I don't think they're going to. In the United States, does not recognize space as a global commons and is not going to accept any language like that. Now, there's another agreement that was never ratified by the United States and was only ratified by a teeny handful of countries. Australia is the only significant one. It's called the Moon Treaty or Moon Agreement. And it went a whole step further. It would have turned all of outer space into something like Antarctica, where you can't do any economic development on Antarctica ever. It's divided up into spheres of influence by countries who use it as scientific research stations, and it would have made space one big scientific study park. And there are some people, some of my friends, Planetary Society, who build robots, love that idea. Let's never develop anything on Mars because I want to keep my fossils pristine. Um, Myself and the Bob Zubrans of the world believe that the outcomes for actual human beings are way more important than preserving dead stuff from millions of years ago. I mean, we're interested in that, and I'd love to know if there was life and what it was like, and I support the science, but that is not as important as improving the lives of actual human beings and protecting our Earth biosphere.
Okay, Ahmad wanted to ask a question, and I don't know if, are you available, Ahmad?
Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, Mr. How are you? I have a question. Do you think that space politics and laws limits the development of space colonization?
Yes and no. So, having participated in space policy and in politics, I'm excited to say there are people in our government and other governments around the world who are very excited about space, and they have the ability to reallocate public resources, take your money and my money, and make us spend it on space things, right? And that's been good because we wouldn't have gotten to space in the first place, and when we did, if they hadn't have done that. Now, on the other hand, they're also able to create rules and regulations that made it hard for other people to enter. So private space companies really tried to get going in the 1980s and were quashed by bad government rules and regulations, most of which that were unintentional, but it wasn't well done. And so that delayed us getting to space. So it's a good and the bad. And there are people who actively, like the Russians, absolutely positively do not believe that any commercial space company should exist or anybody should be allowed to do anything that isn't the government. And they'll oppose that in the United Nations and make it really hard for us or anyone else to adapt the Outer Space Treaty to a more reasonable working model that can encompass the rights and responsibilities that I was talking about. So it's both good and bad, and that's why people who understand the space domain and care about it need to become politically active. They need to talk to their representatives or consider running for office and voice their opinions on why there's a better future for humankind in space, and we need to help make it happen, and we need to let it happen.
Okay, and Han Lu would like to know, is it possible for China and the United States to cooperate in space missions in the future? And how high is the wolf clause limit? I'm not sure if that's how you spell it or say it.
I'm not sure about the wolf lemon or whatever. I don't see that in the chat, but I'll look for it. Let me address the first question about China and the U.S. I mean, technically, it's possible. The U.S. cooperated quite a bit with the Russians, and the Chinese hardware for human spaceflight is based on the Russian model. Their vehicles, Shenzhen, I've got a model of it up there, a nice gold one, is almost exactly the Shenzhou is almost exactly the same as the Russian Soyuz. So technically, it's possible. Politically, I don't see it happening right now. The situation between the United States and China and the ideological differences continue to get more and more distinct. And I believe there's conflict brewing over Taiwan. China has indicated they believe that Okinawa might be part of China as opposed to part of Japan, and that's just not going in a good direction there. Also, I don't think it's a good idea, as I noted with my competition slide. I think having the US and China trying to beat each other and having President Biden and President Xi going out there every day and saying, we're better and look what we did, is going to do more for each of our countries and for humanity than working together. Working together does not produce better results. I know it sounds good and everybody wants to say it so they can feel like they're good global citizens and human beings, but the evidence simply suggests that competition is more powerful than cooperation. That said, the US and China must cooperate on some basic things to make sure we don't end up in conflict over resources in space or space orbital debris. We're going to have to reach agreements on making sure our stuff stays out of the way of their stuff and vice versa. And I hope we can do that. And I think that's entirely achievable. But I hope we both work really hard to beat each other every day and make the world more interesting.
So competition is good for moving things forward, but cooperation is necessary for fixing things that we need to fix. Okay.
And I think the US and China both have an interest in being able to access resources in the moon. Now, what was this other question about some limit?
I didn't know. I'm not sure if it's spelled correctly, the wolf clause limit, but you may have said it and it may not be spelled correctly on the question. You were talking about the limits in space.
I might, the Kármán line? I don't know. Was I talking?
Yes, I'm not sure. Han-Chen, if you could retype that. So we can see what you mean. It's something I'm not familiar with personally. And while we wait for that, thank you, Dr. Autry. Okay.
And I know we've run over time. I can go for another 5 minutes if you want.
Okay, they said forget it because this may involve political issues. Okay, so that's fine. But thank you for the question. Maybe we'll, figure it out along the way.
No problem. I hope there's never an actual conflict and there's just a lot of competition.
Yes, I agree completely. And thank you so much for taking the time to speak to the students. This will be uploaded on YouTube in the next 24 to 48 hours. And please share that link with me if you want to put it in the chat or email me. That would be great to the talk that you were speaking of. And students, I will give you some information while Dr. Autry puts that in the chat. I have sent you all an email. Please click these blue links. There's a form for you to fill in. It's just agreeing that you're going to participate in the competition meaningfully and cooperatively with your team. And I have given you the list of the teams. Now, it is possible that 1 or 2 people may be changed from one team to another because we still are receiving entrances to the competition. So click this blue link here and it'll take you to the list of teams. And they're divided by letters and these purple lines. If you don't see your name, please let me know. Also click this link where it says form to fill out this questionnaire stating that you agree to participate. And please do that as soon as you can. And now that the teams are pretty much assigned and it will mostly stay the same, you can go ahead and start working together. You can start a Discord. Okay, Angela. I'll send that to you, Angela. Let me write that down. You can start a Discord if you would like, or use some other platform to communicate with your team. Thank you for the link, Dr. Autry.
So the first link is the text of my speech in my Forbes science column, and the second one is the YouTube link to the actual speech itself at Oxford.
Let me open both of those before I close the window. Okay.
That I have to go.
Okay, thank you so much. And I really appreciate your talk, and the students do as well.
I wish them all the best of luck. Keep up the good work.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
All right, students, if you have any, you feel free to click those links that are in the chat and save those if you want to look any more information up. And remember, you can start your Zoom talks with your team now. You can start planning. You can start distributing who is going to do what part. Make sure you look at the rubric. It tells you what's required. There is a paper that has to be written in a slideshow for your presentation. Please feel free to ask me any questions. I will be assigning mentors over the next couple of days. I will be a mentor of one of the teams, and you can email me any questions. Angela, I will send you that email and put you on the email list for all the things I've sent out. Any questions for me?
Yes.
Yes.
I didn't receive any email yet.
Okay, I shared, let me look. I shared them. So Ahmed, are you ahmed.sadek.albasafba@gmail.com?
Yes.
Okay. I wonder if your team, because I added your team this morning, so I will re-add them. Are they going to be participating as well?
Yes, the next lesson.
Okay, awesome. So did you receive any email from me at all about with the links to the syllabus and the rubric? Because I sent that this morning.
Yes, I received it.
Okay, so you did get that one. Okay. I will resend the most recent email. Any other questions, anyone? Okay, I will see you Monday. We have Monday, we have, let's see. We have Stephen Kane, Professor of Planetary Astrophysics at UC, at the University of California, Understanding Planetary Habitability. Lee Irons, he will be talking about sustainability science in space. And Morgan Irons, she will talk about ecology in space and how we can use ecology for a human mission to Mars. So if you have any questions, email me anytime. I'm on Pacific time, so I usually answer emails from 7 in the morning till 10 at night Pacific time. And I appreciate you guys all participating, and I will send out those extra emails. So thank you very much. Okay, bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.